Well, today we're going to finish talking about M butterfly. I have quite a few different things to help us with it. A couple of links online that we'll look at. Pull them up. How many of you had a chance to look through the Orientalism link? No? All right. Well, what I wanted to do today is start by thinking about some of the Orientalist things that we talked about on Thursday, just to get us back in that mindset since it's been a week since we did this, unfortunately. So, the stereotypes of the East that we have here in the West, we call those Orientalism, right? Okay, so Orientalism is not a true vision of the East, but this idea that the West has put on it. Now, what are some of those stereotypes? What does the East look like in Orientalism?
Delicate flower.
Okay, good. So Kathy said delicate flower. Jill? Did you say something?
No, I was just going to say smaller.
Small.
The women are thin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you brought up women. Does women play a part in this? Tina?
I'm thinking feminine.
Mm-hmm. Good. So there's definite feminization in this idea.
And probably feminine is probably more of a subordinate.
Mm-hmm. Subordinate. Passive comes up a lot, right? Okay, now, we have all of these for the East. We know that Orientalism sets up a false dichotomy, right? So it's a lot of our anxieties being placed onto it, what we don't want to be. So we want to also think about what does the West look like in this false dichotomy. The East is delicate, small, feminized, subordinate, passive, and we forgot also older, right? Old and stale.
Uncivilized.
Yeah. What does the West look like then?
It's masculine.
Mm-hmm. Good. So we
Strong.
have the masculine, strong,
Aggressive.
aggressive. Good.
Civilized.
Civilized. Yeah, a lot of times you see them as being civilized. What else?
Well, I was going to, like, it kind of go along with the civilized, but refined and
Wealthy, probably.
Refined. Okay.
Wealthy.
Forward-thinking.
Will wealthy be Oriental? I know.
Well,
male
we can
passive.
kind of go on both sides, I think.
Yeah.
It doesn't really fit into that dichotomy because we still have some of the idea of the Orient having all of these riches, right?
Right.
But would we also say forward-thinking, progressive? All right, and so we see these played out so far, and have you picked up on more and more of that as the book goes on, these fantasies? All right, we see that played out a lot in the West. It's interesting, you talked about this a little bit on Tuesday, because with this false dichotomy, there's really no desire for the East to actually become the West, right? We want the East to stay the same. Why, in this Orientalist vision, does the West want the East to stay the same?
because it's exotic. It's
Good.
outside the norm.
It's exotic, and we can put all of our fears on them. Everything that we don't want to be, we can say, this is what it is, right? So it sets up this false dichotomy. If you remember in the book, Helga says, East is East and West is West, right? That famous Rudyard Kipling, never the two shall meet is the way it finishes in the end. We don't want them to come together. Instead, Orientalism, I keep saying we, and I probably shouldn't say that, but this Western Orientalism idea wants to go and pillage the riches of the East and bring them back. Just like we want to go and, or the West wants to go and take the women from the East and bring them back, right? And so in that construct, if you're going to the East, bringing back all of the riches, bringing back the people, we don't want those people to become wrapped up in our ideology. We want them to be subservient still. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's an interesting sort of thing that's being set up here. I want to remind you also that the play is important for David Henry Hwang, not just because of the way it positions the East, but also because of the way that affects continuing perceptions of Asian Americans. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Now, in the play, do we have an Asian American? No, not really. It's written by an Asian American, but we have a Chinese man and a French man, pretty much, right? But at the end of class, I want to talk about how this goes to the heart of Asian American relations, continuing stereotypes that we see, why he's writing it, to subvert these ideas. Okay? So do you think that we still have some of these ideas?
Yes.
Floating around?
For especially the baby boomers, I think I've noticed a lot of the young crowd, my generation, the younger, seem not to be so biased. But there's still some.
But, and especially this one, because it seems
less.
so insidious. We'll talk a little bit about the model minority today, the myth of the model minority. How many of you have heard that before? Model minority? What's the model minority?
Well, that regardless of who you speak to, and you ask them, what does an Asian American look like, or what are these myths that we're talking about, you'll come up with the same answer. That it is almost as a, I don't want to say requirement, but as an automatic.
Okay. So the model minority stereotype in the U.S. actually promulgated by some of our laws and legislatures. Some of our, Bill Clinton actually is the one who started it. But it's the idea that Asian Americans are hardworking, really good. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, intelligent, and every other minority should look to them. Now, it sounds like a positive stereotype, right? Is it positive?
No.
In what ways can that be very negative? You're right, it's extremely negative.
Because, I mean, for number one, you're saying that every minority should model themselves on Asian minorities.
So what can that cause?
Tension amongst the
A
minorities.
lot of tension, a lot of friction. So I think most of you are probably old enough to remember the Rodney King meeting out in LA. And we painted that in our media as a black-white issue, right? But what's not known and not brought up a lot is all of the buildings, the shops that were burned to the ground were Asian American. Because there was a lingering tension between Asian Americans and African Americans. Some of what is built on this idea of the model minority myth. It also hides the very real fact that Asian Americans, while they seem to be doing really well, they're not without their needs as well. We still have a very large underclass of illegal garment workers in the country. Okay? Very long legacy of that. So the model minority myth and the model minority stereotype, we'll talk about a little bit at the end of class today, but more when we get into Tropic of Orange as well. One of our protagonists, Emmy. Anyone started reading that yet? Tropic of Orange? You met Emmy yet?
No, not yet.
Emmy's very, very brazen, brash Japanese American woman, and she completely confronts this Asian American stereotype. But yes, you all will start reading that book for Tuesday, and I hope you enjoy it. It's one of my favorites. All right. One other thing I wanted just to touch back on is this feminization and emasculation of men that you all talked about. What in our country's history helped also promote the feminization of Asian Americans? This idea of Asians. We talked about it a little bit on Tuesday. What in our country also helped to promote this idea of the feminization of Asian American?
The jobs that we made them.
The jobs. Okay, so what sorts of jobs were Chinese allowed? The laundromat. So that's women's work, so it's further emasculation. What else also contributed to that?
We don't know the men women.
Yeah, the known women. So laws restricting the number of Chinese women who could immigrate to this country. Right? I pulled a couple of statistics for you. So I told you that 61% of the Chinese women in California in 1870 were prostitutes. Right? I told you that. Again, because most women couldn't get over here. That was pretty much the only job they could get when they got here as well. In 1855, they were only 2% of the Chinese population. So started coming over in 49. 6 years later, Chinese women represent only 2% of the Chinese population here in the States. And then, as I told you, in 61% in 1870, all right? So this formed the bachelor societies that we talked about, and that was further emasculation, proof to the public that they couldn't get a woman. But was that necessarily the case? No. There were laws restricting Chinese immigration. Why couldn't they get a white woman? Racial tension. It was also in California for a while. It was on the books that if you were a white woman and married a Chinese American, you would lose your citizenship. So there's a lot of laws at work that are also crafting this emasculation. By 1940, there are 6 times more Asian men to Asian women. Okay, so even in 1940, we have this change. Now in 1945 is when we relaxed a lot of our restrictions on immigration. What do you think prompted that? It's happening around 1945.
World War II.
Okay. The end of the war, and who were we fighting in World War II?
Japs.
Okay, and so what happened over in Japan occasionally? Found some butterflies over there,
Oh, yeah.
brought them back. So we had to relax, change the way that our immigration patterns worked to accommodate warriors who had gone over who wanted to bring what they called war brides back. The act was actually called the War Bride Act. then we start actually increasing the number and the ratio. So by 1980, we are actually getting to be more commensurate, have a pretty good balance of Asian men and Asian women. A lot of 1980, the reason why that number is so important is that's when the garment industry began to boom, and they began to go out and get a lot of these illegal workers to come in, work for nothing. All right. So, again, the relationship of East and West is mirrored in Madame Butterfly, which a lot of this is predicated on. So we're seeing, and I think it's pretty obvious now, that this is a total rewriting, deconstruction of Madame Butterfly. On page 82, Song realizes perhaps the most apt quote of the whole play. Song says, "As soon as a Western man comes into contact with the East, he's already confused. The West has a sort of international rape mentality towards the East."
What act was that? Where
I'm
I was
sorry,
just
that's
different
right.
pages?
Act 3, scene 1. And we're going to come back to that scene later in the class. We definitely want to look at it. Where he's talking to the judge, and he sort of reveals everything. So what does he mean by, as soon as a Western man comes into contact with the East, he's already confused? It's Act 3, scene 1. You got it? As soon as a Western man comes into contact with the East, he's already confused.
I would think a cultural difference.
Okay. Right, the cultural difference. Yeah.
That's right. If I went to France or just China or some other country I've never been in my life, I would be a black sheep in the whole kangaroo flock.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, he already has all these notions about the Eastern man anyway, so he doesn't know if what he's meaning is, you know, oh, you're a contradiction to your stereotype, or wait,
Right.
yeah.
Good.
So he's confused already.
He's already confused, and maybe partially confused because the East doesn't look like the East he's imagined or understood.
And then attempts to make it fit
Right.
what he's seeing with what his perception or what his stereotype is.
Or if he's talking about the man, Gilligard, what his name is, Gilligard, if he's confused, then it's probably because he got used to that culture, and then when he went back home to France, he realized he changed so much.
I don't know that Gallimard really changed so much when he went back to France. Gallimard, I think, well, let me pose this as a question to you all. Do you think Gallimard changed when he went to France? Or do you think his perceptions of the East that he had stayed the same?
I think they stayed the same.
And how do we know that from the text? What does he do as soon as he sees Song?
Oh. Well, he strikes out, you know, he tells her that it was a fantasy, like that when faced with the truth, he would rather stay in the fantasy.
Exactly, yeah. So he sees Song. I think a nice touch that they put in the play is, how does Song show up to him when she's in France? What does she bought for the occasion?
A kimono.
A kimono, good. Why is that important? Why does she buy a kimono to go and see Gallimard?
Because it puts her back into the part of what she was in Gallimard's life, like the way he saw her.
Right, and Hwang is really savvy here because it puts her back into the part, but back into the part of the mysterious Chinese woman or into the part of Cho-Cho-san?
Cho-Cho-san.
Right, right. So we see that she's taking it even a step further. Do you think Gallimard notices the difference? Says, you know what, you never wore a kimono in China, what's going on? You know, he's just overtaken by what? His own orientalism, his own misperceptions. Yeah. So I have a feeling that Gallimard doesn't really grow. Okay. Let's go back to scene 6 in Act 1. That's one we haven't quite gotten through yet. I don't think any of you have the same book I do.
Page 16.
Thank you. Page 16. Okay. So this is where Gallimard goes to see Song. And this is where we see Song playing Gallimard, right? This is where we hopefully are savvy enough to catch on to what's happening. Okay. So, Act 1, Scene 6, on the second page, what's going on here? Where has he met her?
At the opera.
At the opera. And what is she playing?